March 6, 1944. Clear skies over Brandenburg. At 28,000 feet, pilot Hans Kogler adjusts the stick of his Messerschmitt Bf-109. The wind cuts like a razor. The radio crackles. The voice that emerges is shaky but clear. Attention, eye contact with single-engine fighters. About Berlin. For years, Luftwaffe officials claimed that this moment would never happen, that Allied fighters simply couldn't fly that far. The math was irrefutable, they said. Berlin was protected by an invisible wall of miles and fuel, but the math was wrong, and now it burned silently inside the cabin. The thesis was simple and false. Nazi Germany believed that distance was protection. That belief was dispelled not by a new secret weapon, but by a simple idea, and by an American factory that churned out fighter jets like automobiles. This is not just the report of an air mission. It is the portrait of a doctrine collapsing under the force of an enemy that has exchanged mythology for logistics. The Luftwaffe looked up at the sky and saw the impossible, and when he saw it, it was too late. On that day, Germany learned that the enemy had wings, and that those wings knew exactly where to land. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story, and it's not in the battles, but in the silence between them. In just 14 months from March 1944 until the end of the war, Germany lost more than 45,000 aircraft, not for lack of courage, nor for absolute technical inferiority, but because the doctrine that guided the Luftwaffe ignored one variable. The impossible had changed sides. The formula was clear to the Germans. No enemy single-engine fighter would be able to cross 200 kilometers, fight, and return. They calculated everything, except what Detroit was capable of manufacturing. The P-51 Mustang arrived in Berlin with fuel to spare, unprecedented autonomy and a simple mission: escort the destruction. What seemed like an exception became routine. If you value accurately told history, with data and analysis without myths, support this work with a like and apply. This allows us to continue investigating what really happened when the sky stopped protecting Germany. Even before the war began, the Luftwaffe was already treated as a masterpiece of modern engineering, the result of the secret rearmament promoted by Hitler in the 1930s. It was not only built, it was conceived as a symbol. Germany didn't just want to fight in the skies. He wanted to teach the world how to fight in the air. Its pilots, veterans of the Spanish Civil War, returned as teachers of a new air doctrine: offensive, fast, elegant. The Bf-109 wasn't just a fighter. It was an aesthetic statement of technological superiority. Light, agile, armed with 20mm cannons, it embodied the German philosophy of combat: surgical precision, absolute control, mastery of the sky through talent and design. The Four Fingers Formation, which replaced the traditional closed blocks of the First World War, represented this doctrinal change. It was an air force guided by logic, geometry, and almost religious confidence in its own excellence. For the Germans, their aviation was the extension of the Germanic soul: rational, clean, efficient. But there was a problem. This doctrine, created for short, offensive conflicts, was never adapted for a protracted industrial war against a logistical superpower. The Luftwaffe was trained for lightning victories, not to withstand the bombing of 1,000 planes a day. And even as reports began to indicate the American scale, Berlin responded with disdain. One high command officer even said, "The Americans are tractor assemblers, not war machines." The belief was that quantity would never surpass quality, but the numbers began to betray this logic. The United States did not just manufacture fighter jets. They manufactured their own war, in shifts with planchettes, saws, and wages. The difference was abysmal. In 1942, Germany produced about 10,000 aircraft. In the same period, the U.S. produced more than 47,000, 4 times more, almost 5. This includes heavy bombers, fighter jets, and transport planes. Each time a Bf-109 was shot down, a German pilot needed 200 hours to return to the skies. At the same time, Detroit was delivering 30 new Mustangs. And when the P-51 entered the production line on a large scale, that advantage accelerated like a tide. If you were surprised by these numbers, comment below with a phrase, "Logistics wins," because that's what the Germans ignored, and they paid dearly. The belief in technological invulnerability also shaped strategic behavior. The Luftwaffe despised the long-range escort. For them, it was a useless concept. Fighters were supposed to be fast, light, and return home. Protecting bombers was a burden. When the first reports on the P-51 arrived, with information about its autonomy, the German General Staff rejected it as a recognition error. No single-engine plane could fly from London to Berlin and back. That violated everything known about combustion, weight, and lift. And yet, they came. They came by the thousands. The internal culture of the Luftwaffe reinforced this cycle. Its pilots were treated as quasi-mythological heroes, while Americans were seen as standardized, serially trained soldiers. The image of the German pilot as a knight of the skies clashes directly with American reality. A Mustang pilot was just another cog in a gigantic logistical system. But that's what worked. German romanticism came up against the coldness of mass production. While Berlin celebrated individual aces like Galland and Hartmann, Americans preferred statistics. Mission coverage, success rate, maintenance per flight hour. It was a war between meter and myth. However, not all Germans were blind. Documents recovered after the war show that technicians and engineers warned of the U.S. production escalation as early as 1942. Estimates of American industrial capacity exceeded the worst nightmares of any German general, but the warnings were ignored or silenced. What began as technical pride evolved into doctrinal rigidity, and when reality imposed itself, there was no more room for adaptation. The Luftwaffe was stuck in a concept of warfare that had ceased to exist. Meanwhile, the skies over Europe began to close. What seemed impossible, American single-engine fighters flying all the way to Berlin, was about to happen. And when it happened, it wasn't seen as a revolution. It was seen as treason. That's the next part of the story. Because the moment the Mustangs appeared on the horizon, the first reaction was not fear. It was denial. An entire system refused to believe what it saw, until he was forced to admit it. And then, it was too late. The Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine was born not of cowardice but of certainty. Certainty based on mathematics, physics, and maps. According to Reich aviation engineers, there was no viable way for an Allied single-engine fighter to cross the English Channel, fly to Berlin, engage combat at altitude, and return safely. It was an impossibility of fuel, weight, and autonomy. This conviction became a strategic foundation. German planners have divided Europe into risk and security zones. Up to a certain line, usually drawn over the Rhineland, Allied bombers could be escorted. Beyond that, they would be alone. The airspace over central Germany was treated as a slaughter corridor. In it, the Luftwaffe flew with dominance and confidence. Their formations moved up to intercept the B-17s and B-24s without fear of encountering nearby resistance. It was a hunting theater. With each American mission, the Germans could inflict heavy losses and return to base in glory. This comfort zone, however, was not protected by guns, but by an equation, and that equation was about to fail. The calculations were based on rigid premises. A P-47 Thunderbolt, the main American escort fighter up to that time, had limited range. The two-engine P-38 Lightning could go further, but they were less maneuverable and expensive to maintain. The absence of a long-range single engine was a known and documented fact. German strategists designed their defenses based on this vacuum. The Allied bombers, once launched over Leipzig, Dresden, or Berlin, would be alone, and alone they would be destroyed. That was the logic, and it worked. During the second half of 1943, losses among bombardment groups reached alarming levels. Missions such as the one in Schweinfurt and Regensburg resulted in loss rates of more than 20%. For every 100 aviators, 20 did not return. The Luftwaffe won the war in the skies, or so he believed. This assurance allowed for a subtle but devastating mistake. The Luftwaffe stopped preparing for the unlikely. The maintenance structure, the fuel, the pilots, the logistics, everything was organized around the repetition of a known tactical scenario. Allied forward bases were monitored. The bomber formations accurately predicted. The very pace of the missions became predictable. It was an accounting war. Germany was betting that the human and material cost imposed on the Allies would make the air effort unsustainable. He was therefore betting that the war would be won by exhaustion. The mistake was to trust that the enemy would continue to try to solve with courage what he could solve with engineering. When the first reports of Allied fighters appearing beyond the theoretical escort line began to emerge, they were dismissed. Reports of fatigued pilots, identification confusions, Hysteria. No technical general would accept that a single-engine fighter was 800 kilometers from his base with fuel to fight. Germany's own military technical culture, focused on precision, control, and purity of design, despised improvised solutions. So they didn't notice the silent threat that was approaching: disposable fuel tanks, modular production, standardized engines, factories running 24 hours a day with civil metallurgy. What German engineers considered inelegant, Americans called efficiency. The difference was not just material, it was mental. Germany was looking for the perfect fighter. The US was looking for enough fighter. The Luftwaffe invested in specialized variants and elite designs. Americans standardized parts, accepted losses, and prioritized scale. The result was the emergence of an aircraft that belied the formula. The P-51 Mustang, light, economical, aerodynamic, coupled to the British Merlin engine, not only flew to Berlin, it escorted bombers, faced fighters, and returned with autonomy to spare. German mathematics had failed not because the calculations were wrong, but because the parameters changed without warning. And when they did, no one in Berlin was ready to redo the math. The most tragic thing is that the mistake was not irreparable. He was invisible, because it was built on absolute truths. The belief that the Allies could never project deep air power without paying an absurd price made any change of scenery unthinkable. Just as the Maginot Line had been built for a war that no longer existed, the Reich's air defense doctrine was stuck in a world before the Mustang. The enemy had changed. The war had evolved. But the German skies were still defended as if nothing could reach the center of the empire. This doctrinal failure will be felt brutally in a matter of days. Because by the time the Mustangs finally cross the threshold of the impossible and emerge over Berlin, the impact will not only be tactical, it will be moral. And he begins with a phrase heard on German soil, spoken by a Luftwaffe officer after a failed mission: "Either our eyes are lying, or we are being hunted in our own backyard." What the Germans called impossible, American engineering called production. The limitation that defined the Luftwaffe's doctrine, scope, was dissolved not by magic, but by a chain of industrial decisions that refused to respect the traditional limits of physics applied to war. The tipping point began with an engine. In 1942, the British allowed the United States to produce under license its most valuable technological asset, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. But the Americans didn't just copy. The Packard Motor Company redesigned processes, adjusted tolerances, reorganized the foundry. The result was the Packard Merlin 1653, a more reliable, more standardized engine that was more adaptable to American industrial needs. While the Germans obsessively protected their designs, the Americans simplified them. The British engine was sewn into the body of a promising fighter, still under development, the P-51 Mustang. It was an unlikely union, the streamlined design of a civilian project, the heart of a British machine, and the logistical soul of the United States. And then came the last element: external fuel tanks, made of pressed paper, sealed with glue and resin. They were disposable, inexpensive, and sturdy enough to withstand the flight to the combat point. A pilot would release them at the touch of a button, and his plane would immediately gain lightness and aggressiveness. That changed everything. With the external tanks, the Mustang doubled its autonomy. It began to fly more than 2,000 kilometers, escorting bombers to Berlin, facing the Luftwaffe on the outskirts of the Reich capital, and returning to base in England. What was just a fighter jet became a bridge. And it wasn't an air bridge, it was an industrial bridge. The secret was not in the air, but on the ground. In 1943, an American engineer remarked, "We don't need a perfect machine. We need thousands that work." This philosophy defined the Mustang. Its structure was simple, its systems accessible, its maintenance agile. It was possible to change it, replicate it, adapt it. Each plane was part of a collective organism, not a single artifact. While the Luftwaffe measured its aces by the number of victories, the U.S. Air Force measured its fighters by their efficiency in accomplishing missions. A Mustang didn't have to take down 100 enemies. It needed to ensure that 100 bombers reached the target. And this difference in mission redefined the value of each piece. Pragmatism replaced glory. Quantity has replaced the myth. The assembly line replaced artisanal pride. The Mustang was the turning point not only because it flew far, but because it was designed for modern warfare, a war of supplies, of scale, of long-range logistics. It was a weapon of the system, and the system was the American war effort. Civilian industries transformed into combat factories. Railways adapted to transport airplane parts. Universities training engineers to overhaul engines in series. There was no more room for improvisation. It was war as an industrial process. And in that process, the Mustang was the most visible, but far from the most important, end product. The real triumph was in the hidden numbers. Constant production, interchangeable parts, refined fuel in record time, trained mechanics in weeks, a machine powered by thousands more. That was the detail that the Germans did not see. While trying to create the ultimate fighter, the Americans created the possible fighter and multiplied it. When the Mustang finally went into operation over the continent, the Germans didn't believe it. Literally, early reports of single-engine fighters near Berlin were ignored or attributed to misidentification. Hermann Göring himself, upon hearing the reports in March 1944, reacted with disbelief. If that is true, he would have said, then we are lost. It was true, and they were, because what crossed the skies of Germany was not just an airplane. It was proof that the war had changed its language, and the United States spoke this new language fluently. The Mustang was the first air combat weapon that did not rely on bravery, individual genius, or luck. It depended on planning, oil, steel, and a culture of mass production. And while the Germans tweaked their formulas and recalculated their ranges, the Mustangs were already flying in close formation, with disposable tanks coming loose like fruit peels in the cold morning air. An invisible force had overcome physics, and it came from the ground. However, the real impact of this turn would only be understood when Mustangs ceased to be a novelty and became routine. The Luftwaffe, which had previously imposed fear in the skies of Europe, was now beginning to avoid direct confrontations. The doctrine of tactical superiority evaporated, because more than the plane itself, what the Germans were now facing was a frequency, a cadence, an unthinkable persistence. The Mustang did not come to impress. He came to repeat. And this repetition was unbearable. On March 6, 1944, this new reality would finally become undeniable. For the first time, American bombers would fly all the way to Berlin, and they wouldn't be alone. What would happen in that sky would mark the end of an era for the Luftwaffe, and it would all start with a distant sound on the radio and an unexpected shadow on the horizon. March 6, 1944. The Allied plan was meticulous, built in layers of protection like a precision machine. At 8:30 a.m., hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombers took off from England toward the heart of the Third Reich. The mission was clear: to destroy Berlin's industrial centers while at the same time testing the new doctrine of continuous escort. The Luftwaffe, monitoring radio signals and radars, identified the massive formation and activated its response. Dozens of Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters were launched from bases in Prussia, Saxony, and Brandenburg. The target seemed vulnerable, slow-moving bombers advancing into open skies, seemingly with no escort cover beyond standard range. It was the kind of situation the Luftwaffe knew well. They would rise, dive, destroy, and disappear. But this time, something was wrong. When the German formations approached the bombers, they did not find the void. They encountered enemy formations. 3 levels of cover had been deployed: thunderbolts in the early phases of the mission, lightnings during the deep advance, and in the final stage, the keystone, the Mustangs, of the 357th Fighter Group. Flying at more than 7,000 meters, with newly jettisoned external tanks, the P-51s lay unseen, above the action. As the German fighters began the attack, the Mustangs dove out of the sky like blades. The impact was immediate. In just 15 minutes of combat, 20 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed. But what happened that day cannot be measured only in downed fuselages. What collapsed was confidence. Experienced pilots, veterans of North Africa, the Eastern Front, and the Battle of Britain, saw reality bow before their eyes. The doctrine, the maps, the manuals, it all said that it couldn't be happening. And even so, it was. The Mustangs had not only crossed the threshold of the impossible, they had done so with tactical, coordinated, and fatal superiority. The geometry of combat has changed. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to attacking from above, was forced to react from below. Heaven was no longer his. The altitude superiority of the Mustangs dismantled the Germanic formations even before the first shot. It was like fighting one's own shadow. And then came the second impact. Repetition. That was not an isolated action. Allied reports indicate that more than 600 escort fighters took part in the mission. With each thwarted attack, more Mustangs emerged from the flanks. The feeling among the German pilots was one of ambush, but there was no ambush. There was planning. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was not reacting to a surprise. It was being outmaneuvered in its own combat logic, and this generated a type of paralysis rarely seen in the air theater: tactical freezing. Some German fighters hesitated. Others aborted. One pilot, in later testimony, confessed that he turned off the radio when he heard that the Mustangs were over the capital. It couldn't be true. If it were, then it was the end. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Intelligence reports already spoke of an extended escort. The reconnaissance photos already showed the external tanks. The idea that the Americans would turn a single-engine fighter into a long-range platform was known, but no one believed it was feasible. Because they didn't believe in the method. The power of civilian production converted into a war machine has been underestimated. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content like this. March 6 was more than a battle. It was a rehearsal for collapse. The Luftwaffe lost 69 planes that day, but it lost more than that. It lost the central sky. The airspace over Berlin, once considered inviolable, became the scene of a duel where only one side was ready for the new war. From that moment on, bombing missions ceased to be suicide and became systematic. The Reich, who counted on distance as a shield, found himself naked, and this strategic nakedness will be explored with precision in the days that follow, because what started as a scare will soon become a habit, and the skies of Germany will never be the same again. Hours after the return of the missions on March 6th, the Wunstorf Air Base was overcome by an abnormal silence. Luftwaffe pilots, many of them with hundreds of hours of combat experience, descended from their aircraft without speaking. Some hesitated to fill out the reports. Others handed over the documents without looking their superiors in the eye. The reason was simple and unacceptable. They had seen enemy single-engine fighters over Berlin, in combat, at altitude, in formation. What for years had been denied by the doctrine, the academies and the high command itself, now materialized before his eyes. But the news did not find acceptance. He met fury. Upon receiving the first reports of the presence of Mustangs in the vicinity of the capital, Hermann Göring, Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe, is said to have reacted with violent incredulity. In a meeting recorded in the post-war archives, he banged on the table and shouted, "This is treason, this is cowardice or delirium, scientifically impossible." And then he demanded the names of the pilots who had reported the encounter. Göring's logic was not based on facts. It was based on dogma, and this dogma was beginning to crumble. What followed was an escalation of official denial. The operational reports were returned for correction. Intelligence officials were ordered to verify the authenticity of the data, while internal messages from the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the use of more generic terms, such as unidentified enemy fighters. The word Mustang became almost banned. It was not censorship. It was an attempt to preserve a constructed truth. The Luftwaffe could not admit that it had lost its monopoly on reach. This would be tantamount to acknowledging that the entire defensive architecture of the Reich was based on an illusion, and more, that the enemy had overcome the technical barriers that Germany itself believed it controlled. Göring's order was not an isolated episode. It reflected a command system that no longer operated on the basis of evidence but on desire. The collapse of the Luftwaffe's internal logic didn't just come from losses in the skies. It came from its refusal to accept that there was a new rule of the game, a game where the opponent produced airplanes like someone who produces trucks, where the advantage no longer came from one-off innovation, but from continuous execution. The reaction of the Nazi high command was to go to war against its own perception. The pilots, previously treated as technical elite, began to be accused of exaggeration, cowardice, or misinformation. Engineering, once celebrated as the nation's spiritual force, now had to double down on calculations to try to disprove reality. And the propaganda, in turn, further reinforced the fiction that the Luftwaffe maintained total control of the skies. The psychological impact was immediate. German escort pilots began to report extreme tension before missions, not only by the visible enemy, but by the climate of internal surveillance. It was as if admitting what was seen in the sky was more dangerous than facing it. A Luftwaffe instructor recorded in Allied interrogation files described the atmosphere as institutional claustrophobia. The presence of the Mustangs was known, but one could not talk about it. The war against the Americans had become a war against mathematics, and mathematics did not answer to hierarchy. It is in this context that the figure of Göring is transformed from commander into a symbol of negation. Fattened by excess power and internal adulation, he had become a prisoner of his own rhetoric. When he finally recognized the presence of the Mustangs on German territory, his response was late and symbolic. In April 1944, he reportedly said, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. But this confession, made indoors, was never brought to the public." The advertisement maintained its narrative, and all the while, the P-51s continued to cross the sky with surgical discipline, as if nothing on the ground could stop them. The collapse of internal confidence has eroded the Luftwaffe from the inside out. It was no longer a force preparing to defeat the enemy. It was a force trying to maintain consistency in the face of absurdity. What began as air superiority was now a battle of versions. And with each mission, with each Mustang sighted, the difference between reality and discourse widened. The Reich had not only lost airspace. I was missing the truth. And while generals discussed reports and censored testimony, American factories accelerated their production. By April 1944, the United States was manufacturing about 650 Mustangs a month. Germany, in the same period, could barely replace the week's losses. But the real impact was yet to come, because far beyond reach or technology, the Mustang would bring another weapon: habit, the repetition of presence, the normalization of the impossible. And when this presence became routine, the German pilots themselves would begin to hesitate before taking off. This will be the next collapse. Not technical, not institutional, but mental. The day fear started to fly first. In 1944, while Germany was turning abandoned caves and salt mines into makeshift factories, the United States was using the Detroit facility to manufacture war like it made automobiles. The contrast couldn't be more revealing. On the one hand, the Luftwaffe relied on fragmented, frequently bombed production centers with manual lines and forced labor, extracted from prisoners of war and enslaved civilians. On the other, the American war effort revolved on conveyor belts, civil engineers trained in record time, and a logistical network that stretched across railroads, ports, and mills. Every 63 minutes, a new P-51 Mustang rolled off the assembly line at North American Aviation in Inglewood. A fighting machine appeared almost as often as a popular car was produced. This wasn't just a technological victory, it was the victory of standardization. While the Germans struggled to keep variants of the Bf-109 operational, with specific parts, specialized maintenance, and artisanal production, the Americans built interchangeable planes with modular systems and parts compatible between units. The Mustang's genius was not only in the design, but in the way it was replicated. Its design had been conceived with functional simplicity: clean fuselage, laminar flow wings, high-performance engine with efficient cooling. But the secret was different. The Mustang could be disassembled, transported, maintained, and reassembled with minimal loss of efficiency. It was a fighter made for a relay war, in which the goal was not to have the most advanced plane, but the most available. This was in stark contrast to German logic. The Reich was still trying to create superweapons, jet fighters, rockets, complex systems, while losing the war of the screws. For each new prototype exhibited in Berlin, the Americans put 1,000 aircraft into operation. It was an abyss between spectacle and repetition. The war had changed, and Germany, stuck with the idea that technical excellence alone would guarantee advantage, did not realize that scale had become the new form of superiority. Detroit didn't win because it was more creative. I won because I was more stable, because its workers were not evacuated by weekly bombardments, because their trains arrived on time, because their parts were all in the right stock, at the right time, with the right manual. Meanwhile, German engineers struggled to assemble wings inside damp tunnels, with unstable lighting and scarce resources. Every day, more than airplanes, they produced despair. This difference also reached the heavens. An American pilot trained at standardized bases in Texas or California flew a Mustang almost identical to that of his colleague in the unit next door. Parts, commands, indicators, all familiar, all taught in series. The average training time in the U.S. had dropped to 27 weeks. In the last years of the war, the Luftwaffe was forced to launch cadets into combat with 110 hours of flight time, many without ever having practiced live fire. It was an asymmetrical war, but not for weapons, for preparation. An American pilot represented not only skill, but the functioning of an entire system. A German driver, increasingly, represented the attempt to keep a myth alive with resources that no longer existed. And there was one more factor: fuel. The United States had virtually unlimited access to oil. Refineries in California, Texas, the Gulf. High-octane fuel flowed to air bases in England like blood in open arteries. The Mustang consumed this fuel efficiently, flew farther, fought longer, and returned. The Luftwaffe, in turn, faced rationing. Many squadrons had to share sorties. In some cases, fighters were towed to the runway to save precious liters. When the pilot took off, he already knew he would only have one chance. It was a war between abundance and scarcity, and there was no genius that could reverse this. The Mustang, more than an airplane, was an index. Each unit built pointed to something bigger: how much the United States could transform civil engineers into war makers, civilian factories into arsenals, metal workers into military assembly lines. The Luftwaffe, which once symbolized modernity, now seemed like a proud, isolated relic, trying to maintain an aesthetic of superiority in the face of an avalanche of pragmatism. The irony was devastating. The nation that had invented the blitzkrieg was now slow. The one that despised bureaucracy now drowned in useless reports. And the one who had taught the world how to master the air now trembled in front of a fighter produced at the pace of a Packer. By July 1944, the situation had become untenable. It is estimated that by this time the Allies were producing more than 7,000 aircraft per month. Germany, battling bombing, sabotage, and loss of territory, barely passed the 2,500 mark. For every Mustang shot down, 3 new ones appeared. With each squadron lost, a new group was activated. The sky became a constantly moving sea, and the Luftwaffe, a shrinking island. The engineers' war had been decided not on the boldest project, but on the chronometer. The one who could manufacture 1 fighter per hour would win, and Germany has never had that time. But the real collapse was yet to come, because when the Reich air bases began to be bombed with fighters still on the ground, the ultimate symbol of the German doctrine of superiority, air combat, disappeared. And at the center of this erasure was the low, continuous sound of hundreds of Mustangs arriving, even before the enemy takes off. By mid-August 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a fading memory. The decline curve, which had begun quietly the previous year, was now becoming dizzying. The number of experienced pilots disappeared with each mission, while the replacements arrived at the bases with little more than 50 hours of flight time, many without ever having fired in real combat. The average training had fallen to dangerous levels. Comparatively, an American pilot landed in England with more than 400 hours in simulators, tactical flights, and real exercises. It was the equivalent of pitting high school students against gym seniors, and the reality was even bleaker. By January 1945, nearly 20% of German fighter pilots had less than 100 total flight hours. The cockpit had become an execution room. The Luftwaffe could no longer even maintain its presence in the air. C-3 aviation fuel, essential for the high-performance engines of the Bf-109 and Fw-190, became a luxury item. The collapse of oil fields in Romania, the systematic bombing of refineries, and the loss of rail routes condemned the Air Force to starvation. Missions were canceled due to lack of kerosene. In some units, aircraft were positioned by hand on the runway to save precious liters. Pilots set off on missions not knowing if they would have fuel to return, and many times they didn't. The statistical irony of it all is brutal. By 1944, the United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft. Germany, only 39,000. But the raw number hides another reality. While the Americans prioritized long-range fighters, heavy bombers, and aftermarket logistics, the Germans dispersed their resources among prototypes, experimental designs, and desperate attempts to reverse the course of the war with breakthrough technology. The result? For every Mustang destroyed, 4 or 5 were delivered to operational units. For every American pilot shot down, there were 3 others ready to fly. The Luftwaffe by this time was losing almost 10 pilots a day, a number impossible to replace. Pause for a revealing fact. In 1944, American production of aeronautical engines exceeded Germany's capacity by 10 times. That's right, 10 times. If this number surprises you, comment below with shocking data or logistics wins. Because more than airplanes, what flew over the Reich was the cold projection of a statistic. And these statistics were winning the war. Mustangs now didn't just escort bombers. They patrolled, hunted. They were prowling around airfields. They attacked enemy formations still on the way up. There were documented cases of German fighters being shot down before they even reached an altitude of 1,000 meters. It was as if the enemy was waiting at the gate. Younger German pilots reported a feeling of panic when they heard the low sound of the Merlin engine still on the ground. One of them, recorded in post-war interrogation, confessed, "From a certain point, taking off was suicide. Heaven was theirs even before we got there." The fight had ceased to be a dispute. It had become a sentence. And the reflection of this situation affected morale. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of the technical elite, became a corroded cog, commanded by orders without realism. Attempts at reorganization, such as the system of emergency units composed of teenagers and men outside combat age, only accelerated the collapse. An airplane without a trained pilot was just flying aluminum, and the skies of the Reich were full of them. Fragile, inexperienced, vulnerable. It was the statistical end of a doctrine that staked everything on individual excellence and despised repetition. But the numerical tragedy still holds a final detail, because even in the face of this spiral of losses, the Allied machine accelerated. The Americans were not satisfied with the dominance of the air. They wanted the total paralysis of the enemy. And that required not only hunting planes in the sky, but preventing them from even taking off. This new stage of the offensive would begin with a change in strategy. The systematic attack on German air bases, not to destroy structures, but to assassinate time, the reaction time, the preparation time, the takeoff time. And this will be revealed in the Mustang's next mission, the time when the sky began to be conquered while still on the ground. October 14th, 1943. The sound of the Wright R-1820 engines of the B-17s filled the sky in an almost hypnotic way. There were more than 290 bombers flying in tight formation towards one of the Reich's most protected targets, the Schweinfurt bearing factory. The mission was strategic. Bearings were the invisible blood of the German military industry, small but indispensable parts for tanks, trucks, planes, and even light weapons. Destroying them meant bleeding the engine of war. But there was a problem. On that autumn morning, the bombers were alone. The range of the escort fighters was still limited, and the crews flew knowing that, after a certain point, the only protection would be the open sky and their side machine guns. When German radars confirmed the direction of the formation, the attack began with surgical precision. More than 300 Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, were launched in successive waves, and what followed was a methodical massacre. Within hours, 60 bombers were destroyed. Another 100 returned with severe damage. Almost 1,000 crew members did not return. The mission, which was intended to shake up enemy industry, revealed another truth. Air range was the new frontier of warfare. The so-called Black Thursday was marked as one of the darkest days of Allied aviation. But contrary to what one might expect, it did not generate a retraction. It generated transformation. What for many would be an argument for suspending bombing in depth, for American strategists became definitive proof that modern warfare required a new logic. And this logic was clear. Without an escort, there is no victory. It was not enough to fly far. It was necessary to fly accompanied. That moment was a watershed moment in U.S. air planning. The failure was not hidden. It has been studied. Analysis panels were organized in the following weeks. Engineers, tacticians, and officers pored over every report, every damage, every pattern of attack. Investment in new escort models has accelerated. The Mustang, which until then was just another technical proposal, became a national priority. And more importantly, the employment doctrine has been redefined. The goal wasn't just to protect the bombers, it was to establish total offensive dominance. Each Mustang would become a precision spear, an extension of American reach, an assertion of presence over enemy territory itself. Meanwhile, Germany reacted in the opposite way. Instead of rethinking his doctrine, he doubled down on his convictions. The success over Schweinfurt was interpreted as confirmation of the central invulnerability of the Reich. The High Command concluded that the enemy range had reached its limit. Instead of preparing for a change, he prepared to repeat the same defense. They ignored the intelligence reports that spoke of new external tanks. They ignored radio intercepts that indicated tests with modified engines. And they even ignored the engineers themselves who warned about the American industrial escalation. The German machine, so precise in its components, failed in its vision. The October victory blinded the command, and blindness would be costly. Because while the Luftwaffe celebrated, Detroit was already on the move. Assembly lines were rearranged to accommodate the accelerated production of Mustangs. The Packard Merlin engine, which had previously undergone adjustments, went into full production. Simultaneously, logistics systems were redesigned to get these fighters to Europe in the shortest possible time, and the pilots were trained with a focus on offensive escort, in-depth combat training, and prolonged combat. It was a coordinated, technical, fast, and above all functional response. The lesson had been learned, and the response, as it would be seen months later, would be relentless. This capacity for tactical transformation is one of the greatest invisible weapons of the United States in World War II. Failure was not punished with censure, but with correction. Each mistake was raw material for an adjustment, and that made all the difference. Because in the end, the Mustang wasn't just a long-range fighter, it was the embodiment of an operational philosophy: detect flaws, adapt quickly, and act at full scale. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, remained stuck in the hierarchy of confirmation. Negative reports were hushed up, troublesome testimonies were discarded, and the belief in the myth of technical superiority prevented any form of reinvention. Black Thursday was the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was the moment when the Americans understood that the war would not be won with isolated bravery, but with systemic persistence. And when the Mustangs finally crossed the skies of Berlin months later, they didn't just bring 50 caliber machine guns. He carried with him the memory of that day, the day they died alone. And now, they would not die anymore. But the real shock still waited in silence. Because in the next phase, what the Mustangs would do was not just protect bombers. It was hunting the hunters. And the moment when the Luftwaffe would cease to be a fighting force and become a permanent target was bound to happen. The enemy was now not only swift, accurate, and numerous. He was invisible until the last second. The mere mention of the name Mustang on Luftwaffe radios, starting in the spring of 1944, generated a change in the tone of communications. Once confident, pilots began to hesitate, to interrupt sentences, to anxiously consult their fuel and altitude indicators. In some units, ground operators have switched to using alternative codes to refer to P-51s in an attempt to reduce panic in pilots still preparing for takeoff. Fear was not now in the combat. It was in waiting. The P-51 had become an operational ghost. It could be anywhere, at any time, above any field. It was a constant, silent, growing presence. And this feeling has earned a name among the Germans themselves: Mustang fever. It was more than a nickname, it was a diagnosis. Military doctors began to record a sudden increase in cases of tremors, flight memory lapses, dizziness, and active refusal of combat. Soldiers with impeccable mission records began to ask for discharge. Senior officers avoided long patrols, citing technical problems. And the explanation was always indirect: they are out there. In later interrogations conducted by the Allies, German pilots reported that the most frightening thing about the Mustang was not its speed or weaponry. It was the fact that it had broken through a boundary that, until then, had protected them mentally: range. What German aviators called the Reich bubble, a psychological safety zone based on the supposed limit of enemy fighters, had been destroyed. Now, even the air they breathed over Berlin carried the suspicion of persecution. The effect of this presence was multiplying. All it took was a false alert, a shadow, a reflection on the windshield to abort a mission. On at least 4 documented occasions between May and June 1944, entire squadrons fell back before engagement for fear of contact with Mustangs. In one of them, the opponent was nothing more than a cloud formation, but the mental image had already been installed. Mustangs were everywhere, even where they were not. Radio intercepts made by the Allies revealed phrases such as "negative," many of them in the northern sector, "don't go up, they are waiting," or "they are already here before us." The tone was no longer combative, it was one of evasion, and this behavior directly affected the tactical efficiency of the Luftwaffe. Every minute that a German fighter hesitated, the bombers moved forward. With each squadron that aborted, a target was destroyed. What's more, the chain of command itself was beginning to lose control over its units. In many cases, pilots ignored direct orders to intercept American formations, claiming visually detected numerical inferiority, even without confirmation of contact. But the collapse was not just in the air. German air bases began to install specific surveillance towers to identify Mustang approaches in advance. Some began to camouflage fighters while still on the ground in mobile hangars, not for physical protection, but for psychological effect. The fewer fighters visible on the runways, the less anxiety the crews on the ground. The war had descended into the realm of perception. The Mustang, quietly, had become a weapon of mental warfare. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but their actions showed desperation. Takeoff protocols have been changed. Now many missions called for mass ascent, several fighters taking off at the same time in compact groups to reduce the risk of being attacked while still dispersed. But this strategy increased accidents. With few experienced riders and many rookies, the chance of collision was real. In July 1944, 5 aircraft were lost on the ground due to coordination failures in emergency takeoffs. The Luftwaffe began to self-destruct, trying to avoid the enemy before they even saw him. In this scenario, the term Mustang fever is no longer informal. It has become a recurring expression in internal reports. A document from the General Staff of Luftwaffe 3, dated August 1944, explicitly mentions, "The increasing operational paralysis of our fighter wings is directly related to the perception of constant presence of P-51 fighters. It is suggested to review psychological training and alert protocols." It was a belated reconnaissance, but of course, the Luftwaffe was no longer just losing aircraft. I was losing my nerves, and the United States knew it. Its strategists understood that true victory would not come from slaughter alone. It would come from habit, of repetition, to make the American presence in the skies as routine as it is inevitable. Each day, Mustangs flew farther, farther, and more confidently. They became the aerial clock of the Reich. They appeared in the morning, crossed at noon, returned at dusk. And the Germans started to wait for them as they would for a weather phenomenon. Air superiority, once a matter of confrontation, was now a matter of coexistence. And the Luftwaffe no longer knew how to live with an enemy that it could not repel, only fear. But the most devastating effect was yet to come, because when fear becomes the norm, the next step is not combat, it's escape. And this escape would begin within the Luftwaffe's own command, when even its generals would admit, "Our skies are no longer ours." In September 1944, the Reich faced a new geography, but not a geography of land, a geography of heaven. What was once an invisible wall of range, fuel, and coordination was now a space completely mapped by the P-51's engines. Each week, Mustangs crossed not only Germany, but its forgotten borders. They headed south, escorting bombers to the oil fields at Ploiești, Romania. They flew east, towards Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Distances, once considered physical limits for a single-engine fighter, have become mere stopovers in the Allied flight plan. In less than 6 months, the Mustang's presence had redefined the notion of aerial warfare. It was no longer about offense or defense. It was about occupation. The heavens had simply changed owners. Technology was just the beginning. The real triumph was in integration. The introduction of standardized VHF radios between bombers and escorts, the synchronized tactical procedures between units from different countries, the creation of repeatable and protected air routes, all of this made the Mustang more than an airplane. He was part of a system that operated like an industrial clock, in which each squadron knew its time, its vector, its altitude, and its target. Meanwhile, German fighters flew with faulty radios, confusing orientations, and less freedom of action. Flying had become an act of survival, not combat. The Luftwaffe, surrounded in its own airspace, now watched the dissolution of what it had always considered its throne, dominance of the central skies of Europe. In Berlin, the commanders themselves already admitted, there was no longer a safe zone. Mustangs surfaced over armaments factories in Leipzig in the morning, appeared over oil fields in Austria in the afternoon, and still had range to protect bombers on the way back. The long-held belief that American fighters would not overtake the Ardennes became a joke among Allied officers. The new doctrine said, if there is heaven, the Mustang can arrive, and this omnipresence was not just geographical, it was temporal. The attacks no longer followed a predictable routine. Instead, Mustangs appeared at varying times in alternating formations, with irregular speeds and altitudes. The goal was clear: to make any effective defensive planning impossible. The Luftwaffe began to lose not only its fighters, it lost its sense of time. German pilots reported bouts of anxiety because they no longer knew when or if they could take off. The sky had ceased to be a room for maneuver. It had become a minefield, invisible and absolute. Meanwhile, American infrastructure was only growing. New bases in southern Italy and northern France extended the range of Mustangs in all directions. The bombing of the Reich's transport facilities, bridges, railways, depots, ensured that the Luftwaffe, even if it tried to react, could no longer move parts, fuel, or ammunition with the necessary speed. And most symbolic of all, the jet fuel itself began to be bombed while still inside the storage tanks. The German flight machine wasn't just bleeding, it was drying up. The Mustang had become synonymous with presence. With every city occupied, with every armored column sighted, with every train intercepted, the Germans knew American fighters would come. Not maybe, not possibly, but surely. And they did. By 1945, Mustangs had already accumulated more than 200,000 combat missions in Europe. Its pilots had shot down more than 4,900 enemy aircraft. And the most impactful, more than 86% of the heavy bomber formation started to cross the heart of the Reich without suffering significant losses. What was impossible in 1943 had become routine in 1945. This was not just an operational victory. It was the negation of German doctrine at its deepest base. The contrast became tragic. While the P-51s flew with 3 fuel tanks, clean radios, new parts, and an entire support system, the Luftwaffe fighters flew with patched parts, rationed tanks, and inexperienced pilots. In many cases, there were barely any pilots. Whole groups of fighters were ready on the ground but without trained men to operate them. The sky, once a metaphor for German power, was now a showcase of its impotence. And it was in this scenario that a Luftwaffe officer, in a letter intercepted by the British at the end of 1944, wrote a sentence that would summarize the entire air turn of the war. The sky no longer responds to our will. Now, he is the one who imposes his on us. The phrase was never published in the newspapers of the time, but it echoes to this day as an unwitting confession of the most brutal truth of war. When logistics win, bravery is not enough. And the next stage of that story will reveal how the Mustang, already ubiquitous in the air, will become a ghost over German soil, hunting planes before takeoff, even before takeoff. In January 1945, Germany faced a type of enemy that its strategy manuals had never predicted: scale. Not the scale of range nor of speed, but the scale of existence. With each Mustang shot down, 2 others appeared with new paint, full tanks, and a ready pilot. With each formation destroyed, another crossed the English Channel a few hours later. The Luftwaffe, which was still trying to maintain squadrons of 3 or 4 aircraft, now saw on the horizon compact groups of 50, 70, 100 P-51s flying in sync. The air was no longer contested territory. It was occupied territory, and the occupation was numerical, brute, uninterrupted. The concept was simple and devastating: choke the enemy until he stopped breathing, and the United States had breath. Total production of Mustangs would exceed 15,000 units by the end of the war, but that was only the surface. Alongside them, another 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters took to the skies on escort and ground attack missions. In addition, there were more than 10,000 P-38 Lightnings, especially useful for long-haul flights. And behind them all, like flying steel hammers, the B-17 and B-24 bombers, produced by the thousands, dropping tens of thousands of tons of explosives on German infrastructure. What the Luftwaffe called combat, the Americans called process. What the Germans ignored was not the engineering, it was the factory. American war production operated like an assembly line for an entire civilization. Detroit, Los Angeles, Buffalo, Chicago, entire cities reconfigured to manufacture war. A Mustang could be assembled every 63 minutes. A B-24 left ready every 55 minutes from a single plant in Willow Run, Michigan. And here it is worth pausing for a statistical finding that is difficult to ignore. In 1944, the United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft a year, 7 times more than all German air production combined. If this scale surprises you, write in the comments, logistics wins. But the abyss was not just for airplanes, it was fuel, parts, food, and training. An American pilot received on average 400 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. New recruits in the Luftwaffe, on the other hand, due to the scarcity of fuel and instructors, were launched in the air with less than 50 hours. In each confrontation, it wasn't just the Mustang that had the upper hand. It was the pilot who operated it. With more practice, more confidence, and more support on the ground, the Americans turned each combat unit into an extension of a larger system, and that system was constantly being replenished by an intercontinental supply chain. On the other side, the Luftwaffe was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Workshops dismantled, air bases bombed, tanks empty. In February, internal reports showed that almost half of the available fighters could not take off due to lack of maintenance or parts. Those who could fly often did not have complete armament, and those who took off knew they were flying against what seemed like an infinite force. "Every time we look at the sky, they are more," wrote a German officer in a letter sent to the Berlin command. "And every day, we are fewer." That war, as one British analyst would say after the surrender of the Reich, was won by those who took the deepest breath. Germany, surrounded without access to Caucasus oil and with sabotaged transport lines, was trying to survive with the last liters of synthetic avgas. The United States, on the other hand, operated with entire refineries dedicated only to aviation, tankers crossing oceans, exclusive locomotives to supply runways in England, Italy, and France. It was a war between a precision engine and an industrial lung, and the lungs won. And most symbolic of all, the Mustangs didn't seem affected by the scale. Even though they were produced by the thousands, their quality was maintained. American industrial standardization allowed parts from different airplanes to be interchangeable, making field repairs easier. A fighter shot down on the ground wasn't a problem. It was a break. Soon, another would take his place. The Germans saw this and did not understand it. "How can they keep so much for so long?" wondered a commander of JG-2. The answer was beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. It was in the warehouses, on the ships, in the training camps, and in the brains that designed logistics as if designing strategy. And that's why, when we talk about aerial victory, we're not just talking about fighters. We're talking trucks, grain, factories, maps, manuals, fuel, radios, mechanics, technicians, pilots, routes, and spare parts. The Mustang was just the tip of the spear. The real weapon was the mass. And this mass moved with a precision that no German tactical manual could predict, because in the end, the question was never, which plane is better? The question was, how many planes can you put in the sky and keep it there? But this mathematics still had a crueler face to reveal, because scale, when it becomes routine, becomes fatalism. And the next chapter will show how, already without strength, without parts, and without hope, the Luftwaffe would attempt a last act of resistance, and see before it the collapse not of its aviation, but of its youth. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer the air force that had crossed the skies of Europe in 1939 with arrogance and precision. What was once a symbol of tactical innovation, technical discipline, and air supremacy had turned into a desperate mosaic of makeshift units, lacking leadership, resources, and purpose. The structure that once selected its drivers from among the best in the academies now accepted teenagers, blue-collar workers, and even the elderly as the last line of defense against an industrially infinite enemy. The dismantling process was not just material, it was institutional. The elite squads disappeared, not because they fell in combat, but because they were diluted in the frantic attempt to recompose irrecoverable losses. In its place, emergency formations such as Jagenverbände 44 emerged, where pilots with 20 or 30 hours of flight time were sent to face American veterans with more than 400. The technical replacement by political alignment further aggravated the collapse. Veteran officers who questioned the suicidal logic of missions or warned of Allied air supremacy were gradually replaced by members of the Nazi Party, men whose ideological loyalty was valued more than any understanding of maneuver or flight mechanics. The Luftwaffe has gone from being a fighting force to a propaganda tool. The result was tragic. 17-year-olds, hastily trained, were launched into the air with worn-out Me-109 fighters, without complete ammunition, rationed engines, and unstable radios. often to defend targets already destroyed or irrelevant in the theater of war. This transition did not go unnoticed by its own members. An internal report from the Gruppenstab of Jagdgeschwader 3, dated February 1945, states, "The survival rate of new pilots is less than 10 missions. Most do not even understand the basic procedures of combat in formation." In other words, the Luftwaffe no longer trained pilots. It sacrificed them. Heaven, once a school, had become a trench, and the Mustangs were still there, silently, waiting for each takeoff to hunt for aircraft still climbing, without energy, without direction. The German air war had turned into a kind of continuous execution. On the ground, hopelessness spread to the bases. Mechanics improvised repairs with parts of different models, adapting Bf-110 hydraulic systems to FW-190 fuselages. Standardization had disappeared. Entire workshops operated under dim light, without spare parts, reusing burnt oil. Each flight was a calculated risk, not just of being shot down but of simply not returning due to mechanical failure. And even so, they flew, because the order was clear: resist until the end. Even if this end was already visible on the horizon. The greatest symbol of this decadence was the use of the Volkssturm, the Nazi People's Militia, as an air recruitment base. Young men who had barely completed elementary school were given minimal instruction and sent to operate Me-2 jet fighters without any real preparation. The result was predictable: falls, collisions, breakdowns, and withdrawals. Within weeks, modern German jets caused more casualty losses than they did in combat. Advanced technology, without the logistical and human structure to sustain it, became just an empty promise. And this promise was paid with lives. The doctrine, which since the times of Spain and the Blitz had been based on tactical initiative and air mastery in depth, was now nothing more than paper. German air combat was reduced to desperate interceptions, without strategy, without coordination, based on incomplete information. The Allied formations, in turn, operated with absolute supremacy. Its Mustangs flew in pattern, with cross-communication between squadrons, with coordinated artillery on the ground, with mobile radar support, accurate weather, and constant logistics. The Luftwaffe was not just fighting American strength, it was fighting a system that it had despised. And perhaps most ironically, the German collapse was not hastened by doctrinal error or technological failure, but by pride. The refusal to admit that the Allied model was superior, not because it was more sophisticated, but because it was more adaptable, led the Luftwaffe to repeat mistakes, to isolate experienced commanders, to insist on symbolic flights while losing the real war. Heaven, which had once been a cause for celebration, was now avoided. Entire bases stopped operating for days, citing lack of weather conditions. But in the logbooks, the truth was cruder. The fear of taking off outweighed any mission. The United States, on the other hand, had reached the point where its air presence no longer needed to prove anything. It was routine. It was standard. It was inevitable. The bomber formations now flew with the tranquility of those walking in friendly territory, and the Mustangs were still there, no longer as instruments of combat, but as sentinels of a victory that was already sealed in the concrete of American factories. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a functional force. Only fragments remained, and silence. But before this silence became definitive, the Nazi machine would try one last card: a desperate, ambitious, technically daring, and morally suicidal plan. A lightning attack with jet planes, executed by a handful of survivors, and an even smaller handful of fuel. The promise was simple: to turn the tables on the air. But reality, like the sky over Berlin, was already occupied. The day Mustangs crossed the skies over Berlin wasn't just a turning point in World War II, it was the silent announcement of a new era. For the first time in military history, a power-projected long-range air force with accuracy, rhythm, and repetition. The presence of the P-51s over the Reich capital was not only a tactical achievement or a strategic surprise, it symbolized the collapse of a conceptual frontier. That air was territory limited by geography. That generation of American pilots armed with Packard Merlin engines and disposable external tanks didn't just fly to fight, they flew to demonstrate a new logic of war. What began as a response to Black Thursday has evolved into a global model of air domination. The logistics behind the Mustangs were just the beginning. Their missions were sustained by an invisible web of forward bases, weather stations, refueling networks, factories in multiple time zones, and an ever-adapting doctrine. It wasn't just technology, it was method, and this method would transform future conflicts. In the years to come, the same doctrine that placed fighter jets over Berlin would be refined in Korea, expanded in Vietnam, automated in the Gulf, and globalized in the 21st century. The concept of air power projection ceased to be theoretical and became operational. Heaven, once the domain of bravery and individual dueling, was now treated as a platform of control, and the Mustang, for its combination of range, reliability, and number, became the prototype of this revolution. The irony is brutal. While the Luftwaffe invested in isolated projects and visionary prototypes like the Me-262, the Americans were already operating on an industrial scale and intercontinental strategic vision. What Goering considered impossible in 1943, single-engine fighters over Berlin, became standard in 1944, and what was standard there would become a model for the next generations of war. An internal sentence of the 8th Air Force, filed in an April 1945 report, sums it up clearly. We are no longer just winning combats. We are drawing the map of the next century. And this new map would no longer have natural barriers, local defenses, or comfort zones. The air war would become an exercise in continuous presence. The enemy, wherever he was, would know. If there is a clue, there will be hunting. And if there is game, the sky no longer belongs to him. In the next chapters, we will see how this philosophy would culminate in one of the most daring campaigns of logistical destruction in history, not against tactical targets, but against the backbone of the Reich, its trains, bridges, roads, and supply routes. Because the true mastery of the air is not in fighting the enemy, but in leaving him aimless. In a hangar in Illinois, civilian workers glued sheets of craft paper on wooden molds. After drying and pressing with phenolic resin, objects were born that at first glance seemed useless, too fragile for war, too simple to fly. But here was one of the most decisive solutions to the conflict: disposable external fuel tanks. They were lightweight, inexpensive, and most importantly, functional. Each Mustang that carried them gained hundreds of additional miles of range, and with that, the entire Luftwaffe defense doctrine crumbled. That paper cylinder, designed to be used only once, transformed a limited fleet into a force of strategic projection. While German engineers sought aerodynamic perfection, experimental turbines, and advanced concept weapons, Americans gambled on what worked, even if it seemed ridiculous. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because the history of war is often not written with steel or blood, but with pragmatism. The paper tank has become a symbol of a philosophy. What matters is not the complexity of the idea, but its ability to repeat itself at scale. The U.S. wasn't trying to reinvent the war. It was trying to win it with speed, volume, and adaptation. For every German innovation that flew once, there were 1,000 paper tanks that flew every day. The Luftwaffe, with its refined engineering, did not see this coming. Because he despised the banal, he underestimated the functional, he ignored the obvious. And in doing so, he signed his sentence. In February 1945, Mustangs didn't just escort bombers. They hunted in formation, fueled by these disposable cylinders, with autonomy to attack and return without support. Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, nothing else was safe. And all because of an object that cost no more than a few dollars per unit. When questioned, an American officer summed it up with a smile. They were looking for the silver bullet. We glue paper. In the next chapter, we will see how this philosophy translated into a brutal and systematic campaign against the arteries of the Reich, the logistical choking operation that turned the German railways into a steel graveyard. Oberleutnant Friedrich Köhler adjusted the Me-109's belts as he had done hundreds of times before. It was March 18, 1945. The sun barely pierced the gray sky of Rechlin-Lerz, one of the last bases still operational north of Berlin. At 27, Köhler was a rare survivor, a pilot from the beginning of the war, coming from a Prussian military lineage, trained in the old doctrine of accuracy and honor. But on that day, nothing resembled his first flights over Poland. The runway was cracked, the hangars mangled by night raids, and his squad mates, 17-year-olds with hurried instructions and blank stares, were preparing for what they knew to be, at heart, A sentence. The mission was to intercept American formations on their way to Berlin. But the reports were vague. The supplies non-existent. Kohler took off with fuel for a 40-minute flight. No ground support. No radar contact. No contingency plan. When he turned west, he already knew it would be the last time. The radio sizzled. Not because of tactical silence, but because there was a lack of spare parts. The left earphone had not worked for days. In front of him, the vastness of the German sky looked more like a trap than a battlefield. In seconds, the illusion of autonomy was shattered. 4 P-51s emerged from the left, already diving, profiled like aluminum arrows. The Mustangs didn't look for targets. They hunted. No direct confrontation. No chance of maneuver. The blast came precisely, going through the engine like a hot knife in butter. Kohler pulled the stick, but the fighter spun around, lost lift, and dived. The radio was still silent. The silence of the booth wasn't just technical, it was existential. No supplication, no screaming. Only the crude acceptance that the war was over, but they had not yet warned him. The Me-109 spiraled into a field near Neustrelitz. 3 houses were hit. There were no survivors. The next day, the Luftwaffe recorded the loss as shoot down on an intercept mission. No mention of the absence of cover, the state of the fighter, or the age of colleagues. Kohler became another number, one among thousands, but his death symbolizes more than the tactical bankruptcy of the Third Reich. It is the intimate portrait of a system that sacrificed its best men in the name of an illusion. The cabin, which had once been a symbol of pride and technological achievement, had become a steel tomb, isolated, silent. Kohler's story is not isolated in the records. Reports from the Luftwaffe Reich show that in the last weeks of the war, more than 60% of the losses were recorded even before any air combat. Pilots were shot down at takeoff, during formation alignment, or in the simple act of gaining altitude. Mustangs, operating with absolute freedom, dominated the interception corridors. It was a logistical massacre disguised as a mission. A German pilot who survived the war wrote in his memoirs, "We flew knowing that we would crash. We just didn't know where or when. The terror didn't come from the fight. It came from the certainty that the fight no longer existed." Kohler had started from a base without a centralized command, where each squadron operated according to disjointed, often contradictory guidelines. The Luftwaffe, dismantled by constant attacks and the drain of its technical brains, was now guided by empty promises and orders of desperation. The doctrine of defense in depth, which had once organized zones of interception and coordinated reaction, had dissolved. The fuel was delivered with an armed escort. The parts arrived in carts. The instruction was given orally, in destroyed rooms. And in the air, the Mustangs, always them, tireless, relentless, invisible, until the moment of impact. The collapse was not just military, it was moral. Veteran pilots, such as Kohler, were reduced to sacrificial scouts. They flew to attract fire, to test routes, to keep alive the facade that there was still resistance. But what there was just waiting. Wait for the gust. Waiting for mechanical failure. Wait for the last takeoff. The sky, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, was now an abyss where only Americans knew their way back. The factory where Kohler's Me-109 had been assembled in Leipzig had already been bombed twice that month. It worked at 18% of its capacity. Its mechanics used scraps from destroyed planes as raw material. The number of engines available did not even meet half of the daily demand. And even so, the fighters took off, because the logic of propaganda demanded that the Luftwaffe exist, even if only on paper. A final report dated April 2, 1945, reveals the level of despair. The Luftwaffe must maintain a semblance of reaction. Every takeoff, even a symbolic one, represents an affirmation of the survival of the Reich. That was it. A theater. And the pilots, like Kohler, were the last actors in a play that audiences had already abandoned. In the next episode, we will descend to Earth. On the rails, more precisely. Because when the Mustangs took to the skies, the Allies turned their eyes to what was left of German logistical capability, its railroads. And what happened next would turn the Reich train lines into cemeteries of steel. Hall, spring 1945. The mansion palace built by Hermann Göring as a symbol of German air power now trembled with the muffled sound of distant explosions. The marble was already cracked. The carpets were dirty with mud, and the windows were covered with the dust of war. In front of one of them he remained standing. Property. His left hand held a ceremonial cane, and his eyes, once haughty, now sought something that no longer existed: the sky, an empty sky, no Messerschmitt, no Focke-Wulf, no white trail crossing the stratosphere, just silence. And then, as reported by witnesses present, Göring heard the news. American single-engine fighters, Mustangs, had been seen over Berlin in broad daylight. No resistance, no interception, no response. He didn't scream. He did not order arrests. He made no speeches. He said only one sentence: "We knew that the war was lost." The scene, brief and symbolic, marks the complete collapse of the narrative that sustained the Third Reich. Göring was not only a commander of the Luftwaffe, it was the embodiment of the doctrine of technical superiority, ideological pride, and belief in German historical destiny. The Luftwaffe had been created under his direct supervision. From the first flights of the Condor Legion in Spain, through the terror of the Blitz over London, to the occupation of the skies of Central Europe, he believed he had shaped an invincible force. But looking out the window and seeing nothing, neither Allies nor Germans, what turned out was not a tactical failure. It was the end of an era. For years, Göring nurtured the belief that German technology was intrinsically superior. It fueled myths about the Germanic air race, about the genius of the Munich engineers, about the inviolability of the Reich airspace. Even when reports showed enemy fighters operating at depth, he responded with denial or punishment. The propaganda machine continued to display images of fighter jets taking off, even though the hangars were empty. But the reality could no longer be hidden. When the Mustangs arrived in Berlin, the lie was exposed at high altitude, and with paper tanks hanging under their wings. The end of the Luftwaffe was, more than anything, an ideological end. Because the U.S. didn't just win with more planes. They won with oil from Texas, with standardized parts produced in Chicago, with engines manufactured in Detroit, and with external tanks glued with resin in New Jersey. They won with intact railroads, with pilots who trained 1,000 hours before fighting, with doctrines that learned from mistakes. Meanwhile, Germany repeated mistakes, ignored the signals, and replaced experienced officers with obedient fanatics. What Göring saw when he looked out the window was not the absence of aircraft. It was the absolute presence of failure. The final irony is that the Luftwaffe, created to symbolize German modernity, ended up as a reflection of its decadence. In the last months of the war, air bases were turned into bomb shelters. Officers traded maps for supply lists. Planes remained on the ground due to lack of hydraulic oil, and when they took off, they were shot down before reaching operational altitude. Superiority, once proud, became a tragic statistic. In April 1945, only 6% of German pilots had more than 100 hours of flight time. More than half of the remaining fighters were out of combat condition. The collapse of the Luftwaffe contaminated the entire war effort. Without air cover, supply trains were destroyed. Without logistical transport, the soldiers went hungry. Without mobility, the fronts collapsed. The Luftwaffe did not fall alone. It dragged the backbone of the Reich with it. Göring, who believed he had created wings for the German future, now watched the rubble of his own arrogance. And when he uttered the phrase, "We knew the war was lost," he was not just talking about the battle for heaven. It spoke of the fall of an empire built on the idea of invulnerability. One of the officers present in the room discreetly noted Göring's remark. The document, preserved in the Allied archives after the war, became a symbolic piece of the Nuremberg trials, because it reveals not only a belated acknowledgement but a silent confession. The Reich lost to what it despised most: efficiency, repetition, humility in the face of mistakes. The war was not won in the sky, but on the factory floor, and in that moment Göring finally saw it, not by Allied intelligence, not because of the courage of the pilots, but by an absence, an empty sky, an open window on a country closed in on itself. Harrenhal Castle was destroyed shortly after, not by enemy attack, but by order of Göring himself, who had the complex blown up to prevent the Soviets from capturing it intact. Only ruins remain, visited today by few historians and curious people. But the image remains. The man who projected the air supremacy of the Third Reich, standing in front of a glass frame, staring at an unresponsive sky. And in the next chapter, we'll examine the legacy of that silence. How the Allies used the supremacy gained by the Mustangs to not only win the war, but redesign the world, one bombing at a time. In the end, it wasn't the Messerschmitt 262 with its jet engines that defined air warfare. It wasn't the Focke-Wulf 190, nor the legendary aces with dozens of kills. It was the P-51 Mustang, a simple, modestly shaped plane that represented something far greater than speed or firepower. The Mustang was the emblem of a concept, victory as a product of process, not myth. While Nazi Germany invested in prestige weapons, in machines that impressed on paper, and in parades, the United States built replicable solutions, fueled by an ecosystem that began in universities and ended in runways in England. The difference was philosophical. The Luftwaffe was chasing glory, America was chasing results. And history, relentless, always favors those who build to last. The U.S. Victory in the air was not due to the genius of a single project, but to the harmony of a system where logistics, training, supplies, infrastructure, and intelligence operated as a cohesive organism. Every Mustang produced was the end point of a chain of sound decisions, from the license purchased from Rolls-Royce to the civilian workers gluing paper tanks. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was romantic. And so everything worked. Germany, with its tradition of artisanal engineering, could not compete with this philosophy. For every German fighter produced, the Americans manufactured 3. For every pilot trained in the Reich, the U.S. made up 5. And more than that, they formed within a system that allowed for error, feedback, and quick correction. In a war of attrition, this was the difference between winning and disappearing. The German generals themselves, after the end of the war, would recognize this. General Adolf Galland, former commander of the Luftwaffe fighter force, stated in an interview, "It was not technical superiority that defeated us. It was the ability to keep planes in the air, with fuel, parts, and pilots." The Mustang might not be the most beautiful plane, but it was the most present. He was there when the bombers needed it most. It was there when German pilots tried to escape after failed missions. It was there when the train stations were bombed. He was there until the end. And this constancy, repetitive and precise, was all that the Luftwaffe could no longer offer. This contrast is revealed even in the language. Nazi propaganda spoke of wings of destiny, of knights of the air, of honor and sacrifice. American manuals, on the other hand, spoke of preventive maintenance, mission cycles, and refueling efficiency. While one side saw war as a stage of heroism, the other saw it as an engineering problem. The Mustang was not designed to impress. It was designed to last, to repeat, to fly. And it flew, so consistently that by the end of the conflict, there were more Mustangs operating in Europe than all the German fighters combined. A brutal statistic, but one that carries a profound lesson. Those who produce fly. Perhaps that's why the Mustang survived the conflict itself. After World War II, it continued to be used in dozens of air forces around the world. He fought in Korea. It flew over the Pacific. It even served in colonial conflicts in Africa and Latin America. Because his legacy wasn't just technical, it was doctrinal. The P-51 taught that modern warfare belongs to systems, not isolated heroes. That victory comes from disciplined repetition, not sporadic genius. And that no ideological superiority survives when confronted with a well-calibrated production line. If the Luftwaffe was the last romantic air force, the Mustang was the first pragmatic aircraft. A bridge between the past and the future, a warning that the age of knights was over, replaced by the age of planners. Therefore, more than a combat machine, the P-51 is a lesson, a reminder that, in times of total war, the real battlefield is not in the sky, but on the factory floor. And that, between the illusion of perfection and the efficiency of the possible, history always chooses the latter. In the next and final chapter, we will see how this winged symbol of mass production not only changed the course of war, but also the course of peace. Because the Mustang, by dominating the skies of Europe, paved the way for the reconstruction of the continent, and it has become living proof that winning is not an act of force. It is an act of persistence. April 1945. A lone Mustang patrols the skies over a devastated Berlin. No more fighting. There are no interceptions. Just silence. The kind of silence that does not represent peace, but the total collapse of an illusion. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of modern warfare, had disappeared. Their fighters did not fly. Its pilots, killed, captured, or deserting. Their doctrines, crushed by reality. The sky, once the ultimate expression of German technological pride, was now the absolute domain of a power that won not by mythology, but by method. The outcome was clear and implacable. The industrial and logistical power of the United States destroyed not only the wings of the Reich, but the very idea of technical invulnerability that sustained it. Germany lost more than planes. It lost its monopoly on innovation, control of the narrative, and the right to set the terms of war. The story of the P-51 Mustang is not just the story of a successful fighter. It is the living demonstration that in protracted wars the decisive factor is not the brightness of the steel, but the depth of the stockpiles. Logistics determines the strategy. The ability to learn from failure, adapt with speed, and produce with scale turns defeats into victories. While the Luftwaffe celebrated individual aces, America trained entire squadrons. While German engineers pursued the perfection of impossible machines, Americans sought efficiency and repetition. The air war was not won by sophisticated ideas. It was won by practical, standardized, and replicable solutions. Hermann Göring himself, looking at the clear sky from Karenhall, would seal this conclusion with bitterness. When I saw enemy fighters over Berlin, I knew all was lost. Not because they are enemies, but because they are there, by the reach, by the frequency, by the scale. That was the real humiliation. Not to have been defeated by a new technological miracle, but by an airplane that was just functional, and too functional. If you've come this far and value this type of research, this cold and honest reconstruction of the facts, enjoy this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps to keep the search for historical truth alive. Comment below, what was the most shocking fact of this journey? Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.